Okay, we have another interview today with authors at Crystal Lake, and today we're interviewing Jacob Steven Mohr, who's the editor of the new anthology, Dead Letters, and I'm going to let him introduce himself now, so take it away.
Mhm. Hi, my name is Jacob. I have been working in horror for the past 4 years now. I've been working in fiction for the past probably 10, if I had to count. Um, I really love what I do. I've been super excited to have this opportunity to edit this anthology, and I'm looking forward to pitching it to all of you.
Okay, so what inspired the creation of this anthology, and why an epistolary format?
I got big into short fiction of 3 or 4 years ago because I began reading Ellen Datlow's like the best horror of the year compendiums that go out every year. She's on like I think number 15 now. Um and I kind of fell in love with this whole new generation of horror authors who I'd never ever heard of before. And so I got back into short fiction. I began reading more and more anthologies and themed anthologies, writing for them. And eventually I decided, I went to school for editing. I used to work in publishing. I could do this maybe, and I created a whole pitch document for it. The first one I pitched was not actually Dead Letters. It was a much more general horror anthology, and that one didn't go anywhere. But Dead Letters, I think, was more specific and it had more of a clear vision, and it got picked up. Um, as far as why epistolary, I think I really fell in love with that format after reading Neil Gaiman's short story called Orange, which is told entirely in just the answers to like a government questionnaire. And like so you have to kind of infer what the guy is asking this little girl who is interviewing about this supernatural occurrence that she went through with her sister. And I was fascinated with this idea that like the format of the story can direct how you read it and make you engage on this deeper level because you have to put so much of your own imagination into it because you're not reading the story so much as discovering it. And I don't know, that just really stuck with me and I began writing more and more stuff like that and eventually it became this anthology.
Yeah, it can be an interesting format to write. I've written a novel, epistolary as well with diary entries, and it was a challenge,
Mhm.
but it turned out quite well. So it sounds like though there were a variety of interpretations writing within the epistolary format for the
There
book.
were
So,
certainly.
so can you give us a quick rundown of some of the stories and what can readers look forward to?
Oh, well, I don't know if I have time to run down all of them. There are 21 stories in this anthology, but I can give you a few. I'll tell you about we had 4 or 5 authors who were invited to participate. I can go through theirs. Our first was Gemma Files, has a story called Echo Chamber, and that is told primarily in transcripts from podcasts because the story is all about like um how like the process of like recording audio, specifically the process of recording music, is an interpretation and can like essentially warp the meaning of music, perhaps even in a sinister way. Um, we had Dear Kelly by Jiang. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Um, Hers was letters in between a living sister and a dead sister, and sometimes you're not sure which sister is writing what, and the dead sister is like crossing out lines from the living sister in order like to make her letters essentially, and so it plays with the physical format in this very interesting way. Um, Next, you had probably the weirdest story in the collection, maybe the weirdest epistolary story I've ever read, "Bury My Bones in the Bastard That Killed Me" by Gordon B. White. His and I've told him this to his face, like his commitment to making that story just as strange and bizarre and off-putting and occasionally incomprehensible as possible is awe-inspiring, and I can't wait for people to get to read that one. Um,
Yeah, it's a great title too.
it is. It's and those are that's essentially like the thesis statement. Well, it's somebody reaching out to you, the reader, saying, "Hey, I've been murdered. You need to avenge my death. Here's all of these weird steps you have to go through to do it because life just gets strange sometimes." What next? What next? We had Regarding the Hand of God by J.A.W. McCarthy. Definitely a personal favorite of mine just because I felt like I really connected emotionally with that source material. That one is pretty traditional. It's mostly in emails and text, kind of the thing I was expecting to get a lot of in like the open submissions, but she tapped into, I think, the modern loneliness that I think a lot of people my age, go through right now in a really exquisite and sweet and heartbreaking way. Um, and then at the very end, we have Drawn Home from Red Lagoe, which is our only illustrated story. This author is a writer and a great illustrator as well. I first worked with her in her Nightmare Sky anthology that she did through her own press, and she illustrated all of the stories in that anthology. So of course I had to invite her to come on because I knew she would do something just tremendous with that. And that one has journal entries, it has letters, it has like some old school like internet forum posts, and of course some illustrations from the author.
That sounds cool.
Mhm,
Okay, so the anthology theme is in essence communication. So,
mhm,
but it's viewed through a horror lens. So, how did the authors play with that theme in their stories? Did they
mhm.
play with fear, heartbreak, desperation?
Well, I think that the horror of communication, if you can call it that, would be the inability to communicate or the inability to be understood or to understand what someone else is saying to you. And quite a number of the stories tapped into that in a really meaningful way. The idea behind epistolary fiction is that it's always kind of a time capsule. We're always reading it after the fact. This is a found document that we're, discovering and reading when maybe we shouldn't, and trying to find the meaning in it. So whatever communication is in it, whatever warning it contains, by its very nature was unsuccessful. If a story ends at like, "Hey, like, this happened to me, and if you don't watch out, it's going to happen to you too." Just the fact that you're reading after the fact means that it's a foregone conclusion. This person that now seems real to you because you're reading it in this format, you know, they met their terrible fate, and now you're involved.
Hmm. Interesting way to look at it. Yeah, it's
Mhm.
a epistolary is a little voyeuristic almost too, I
It's
would say.
extremely voyeuristic. At the very least, it feels very sneaky at times to read it because, a lot of this is meant to be privileged communication.
Yeah. It's kind of a bit of a contradiction too, because in one instance it's very intimate, but in another it keeps you at a bit of a distance because you're reading it through whatever communication, through a letter or through a text or
Mhm.
whatever. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, there is that lens you have to in a lot of fiction, like, if you're writing in first person, you get, like, a lot of interiority, in that writing. With found fiction like this, you really don't get any of that. You have to read the characters very obliquely.
Mm. Okay, so which story stood out for you personally?
Of course, Regarding the Hand of God by J.A.W. McCarthy was a huge one for me. No Blood, No Bones by Zachary Rosenberg, I thought was an extremely effective use of historical horror. That is a Viking horror story.
Ooh, Vikings. I love Vikings.
I don't think I'd ever read a Viking horror story before, but it was really just a tremendous effort there. And The Parthos UFO Incident by T.T. Madden. When I read this one, I knew immediately that that one had to be the opener because it was kind of like this, like the quintessential. epistolary story. It had a whole bunch of different formats all jammed together. It made tremendous use of the format. It had, my personal favorite format, which is like found footage in there. And it really went all out to make it seem like it was just a collection of documents that you have to kind of make a story out of. And there was nothing else, nothing else in the table of contents that I thought would be a better way to say, this is what this anthology is about. This is what you're in store for.
Mm, that sounds very interesting. So were there any stories in the anthology that surprised you?
Well, to get onto this table of contents, you had to surprise me a little bit. We had over 300 submissions to this over the course of the 2-month open submissions period that we had, and one thing that struck me as I was reading all of these is, as much as I love the format and reading epistolary fiction, reading 300 of them in 2 months, they do start to run together. Like, you start to like the intros begin to sound very similar. Like, hey, here's this collection of documents. What can you do with them? And so because of that, like, I had to really pick through, like, who's doing something new, who's doing something different, who's surprising me out of the gate. And so I'm proud to say that all of these 21 definitely surprised me in at least some way and made their mark very quickly.
Did any story take a turn that you weren't expecting?
Oh, yes, absolutely. A great example of that would be In the Event by Liam Hogan, and that is a story told in letters from a deceased older husband to his young, I guess the term would be trophy wife, someone who is definitely married this old man for his money and now stands to inherit everything. And he is leading her on a bit of a scavenger hunt to find his second will that will leave her significantly more wealthy than she was at the start of all of this. And the twist at the end, and of course I'm not going to spoil it here, but the twist at the end of that one is so cruel and so devilish and so Twilight Zone twisted that it made me close my laptop at the time. It was like, nope, not dealing with that right now. Nope.
Okay, that's the mark of a good story.
But then, of course, I had to go back to the author and say, listen, I have to have this story.
Okay, so what was your favorite thing about editing the anthology?
I hadn't got to I hadn't gotten to edit in this capacity in quite a while. I used to do a little bit of work editing like full-length novels freelance, but what was most exciting about this was the opportunity to work with a lot of authors who had not really done this before. I know there's at least a couple of authors in here who are like, this is their first anthology. There are some who are like, this is their first like English language publication. And so there was, some excitement there of like, I get to be their shepherd into this world. And of course, it comes with that, there's a lot of pressure, a lot of responsibility as well.
Mm, definitely. So, what was the hardest thing about editing the anthology, and did you run into any unexpected issues?
I knew that this would happen when I went into it, but I didn't anticipate, quite how difficult it would be to get over at first. And that's when you have a story that you love a lot, but this open submissions period is still open. You're still reading other stories. You can't accept anything yet. And because I made the decision to have it be, simultaneous submissions, so you can withdraw your story if it gets accepted elsewhere, there were 3 or 4 really good stories that I lost out on.
Oh, that does sound a bit upsetting.
It's disheartening
Part
for
of the
sure, but
business,
yeah,
but
that's part of it, and that's part of running something with simultaneous submissions. You always run that risk,
mm,
but you
yeah,
also get more submissions that way.
Yeah, yeah, you can take some consolation that the story is probably going to be published elsewhere,
Mhm.
if not in your anthology. However, but
Yeah. I'm certainly glad those stories are out there. I wish they could have been mine,
mm.
but that's showbiz, baby.
Okay. So, did you run into any issues in setting up the layout or the format or anything like that, or did it go
Uh,
smoothly?
layout, you mean like the interior layout?
Anything.
Oh, um, honestly, not really. Like the biggest challenge was like this was deciding like the order of the stories, but I had a pretty robust system for doing that, and so that went relatively smoothly.
Well, that's good. So, what are some of the other projects you've worked on?
I have 4 books of my own out, and the 5th one, which is my second short story collection, Bury Me Cold and More Last Words, is coming out in 2025 from Quill and Crow Publishing.
Okay. So, tell us about some of your other books. What are they? Collections, or have you got a few novels under your belt too?
It's a lot of different stuff. My first book was actually my honors thesis. I went to school for creative writing, and so our final project was to write a book. And I did a fabulous short story cycle called The Book of Apparitions, which is currently out of print, but I've since self-published it. You still can technically find it out there, but you know, I wrote it in college. Go into that with a grain of salt, I guess. The second one was a fantasy novella called Daughter of Man. The third one was my proper debut novel from Cosmic Egg Books called The Unwelcome. And the fourth one was my first collection, Nightfall and Other Dangers.
Mm, good. So, what's next for you?
Got the second collection coming out. I've got promoting this coming up in the next month or so. Uh, Hopefully another novel or novella, and eternal short stories because boy do I love them.
Yeah. Are you going to stick with horror, or are you going to branch out a little bit?
I think I'm gonna stick with horror a while longer. Like I'm really enjoying it. I've really hit my stride with it, but I'm always pulling other stuff into it. Almost nothing I write is ever pure horror. Like it'll be horror with a lot of like science fiction, horror with a lot of fantasy, horror with some detective elements or crime elements. Um, I think that sticking with just one thing is the purest and easiest road to stagnation.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I'm always pulling other things into the horror, or pulling the horror into other things.
Hmm.
Okay, so I think we'll wrap the interview up here, and I'd like to thank you for being our guest today. It was a
Well,
pleasure
thank you so
talking
much for
with you.
having me.
Okay, and that's it for this interview. Bye for now, everybody.